Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. I also acknowledge we are meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respect to elders, past and present, and extend this respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I welcome the opportunity to talk about my research on the barriers and enablers to conducting domestic violence research with children, and I thank the AIC for this opportunity. While 49 people from 5 cohorts participated in my research, including 15 domestic and family violence service providers, 6 child clinicians, 8 domestic violence researchers, and 9 ethics committee members, today I'm talking to you about the 11 mothers who participated in my research. But before I begin, I would just like to do a content warning. Domestic violence affects many of us, and I would like to acknowledge this and the lived experience in this room and online. I'll be sharing quotes from mums with experiences of domestic violence and their views and perceptions about children's participation in this research. There are strong views and feelings about domestic and family violence research, the sensitivity of the topic, and conducting this research with children. If this content raises any concerns or sensitivities for you, please feel free to take a break. So some takeaway key messages for you. A mother with experiences of domestic violence said, as you go through the journey, you realise you learn more about the domestic violence and the impact on the children. Another mother said, children all react differently. For example, one of her sons became very hostile, scared and dramatic. Her daughter focused on her schoolwork and excelled, while another child became very quiet. As victim survivors, children have the right to safely participate in domestic violence research, policy and service development processes. We need their voices and impact in co-design processes. Otherwise, our programs and services will fall short and not adequately address children's unique circumstances. My research indicates that significant barriers to children's participation exist, relating to safety and protection. We also need a paradigm shift, which further spotlights children, their rights and needs within the domestic and family violence system, and I'm hoping the new national plan will assist us in this. A mum said, I think they're a voice that we don't listen to. I don't think there's enough thought or focus put onto the impacts of DV on children or long-term on children. It's all around the mum. Let's look after the mum. Safely enabling children's participation in research policy and service reforms requires a lot of care, time to establish trust and rapport with mums and with children and with services, resources, planning, and ultimately ethical consideration. A mother said, you need to go gently. It's about working with gatekeepers and stakeholders, such as mums and DV services, on the importance of engaging children, and that you demonstrate that this can be done safely. Mothers wanted the highest level of safeguarding, where researchers evidence how are they going to ensure the safety and the protection of that child in that research process. From mothers' views and perceptions, and from the views of all participants in my study, the STAR model of attuned trauma-safe participation was developed. STAR standing for safe, trauma-safe, activity-based, relational and rights-based. Mothers, there we go. Mothers' responses about the barriers to children's participation in DV research concerned fears and safeguarding and the critical need and imperative to safeguard and protect children. Fear of the perpetrator. Mothers had prevailing fears which presented formidable barriers to children's involvement in research. The greatest fear related to the perpetrator of the violence, and this profoundly impacted mothers' preparedness to consent to children's research participation. Mums were fearful about the perpetrator of the violence finding out that the child had participated in research. Some indicated they would feel totally overwhelmed and stressed if approached to consent for their child to participate in research. Drawing on a clinical term relating to the hierarchy of fears, mum's fears were at the highest. Some extreme and some off the scale. Regarding fear of the perpetrator, one mum described this as the big black cloud that sits over the top of things. The perpetrator of the violence remains ever present. Fear is definitely the biggest thing that's affecting people because you are so scared to do anything. Despite mums being in a safe place, some living in a different location, a different state, and having no contact with the perpetrator, their fears were still very real and would resurface if they were approached to consent to children's research participation. They used language like terrified and scared that the perpetrator would find out about the child's participation. One mum described her experience of DV as like being in a prison. You are isolated, you're instilled with fear because everything comes back to the perpetrator. Mums were fearful for their children. As one mum said, they'll talk to you, the researcher, and in 10 days' time, they'll go back to the perpetrator and the guilt that they're going to feel about that. It will be too dangerous. Mum's fears about DV research with children, however, extended beyond the perpetrator. They were fearful of other systems and processes and what children's participation would mean for them personally as mums. Holding secrets. Mums were fearful that secrets might be revealed. A child's participation in research may mean that secrets about the real domestic violence would come to light. What might be exposed or revealed by the child? Would the impact of the DV on the child become more apparent? Holding secrets related to stigma, feeling shame, being blamed, and the hidden, silent issue of domestic violence. One mum said, "You've got this shame. If you talk about it and the kids have been around and they've been affected by it, what are people going to think? Because your self-esteem and confidence is rock bottom." Another mum said some people don't want their children to know there's a problem in the family. They want to pretend everything is fine. Some people are like that. I've had to do that a few times. There were concerns expressed that if children participated in research, they might be bound by further secrecy. And if this expectation exists, that they had to keep quiet, this would be no different to the secrecy they maintained when they were living with domestic violence. External systems, legal systems, child protection and mental health services. There were significant concerns and anxieties about the possible flow-on effects of children's research participation. Legal implications. 4 mothers discussed protracted family law matters, up to 9 and 12 years in duration, and the impact this had on their children. For example, children being accused of lying, which ended up in court reports and being used against them. Mothers were worried that what the child said in research could be used against them if research documentation was subpoenaed. A mother gave an example of sessions with the counsellor and school counsellor being subpoenaed and used as evidence by the child's father to say that it was all make-believe and that his child really didn't fear him. This mum said there would be no way they would allow children to talk to anybody without knowing there was no way the perpetrator was going to have any idea that this was happening. Another mother spoke about the pressure being put on children. All of a sudden, we'll be putting all this pressure on kids to have the answers that maybe they shouldn't have, particularly in family law courts, in criminal courts. Are we then going to start expecting children to become witnesses against their parents? That would be my concern. One wall comes down, all of a sudden, lots of walls come down. Child protection. 5 mothers mentioned involvement with child protection services. For some, the experience left them being fearful that domestic violence research might lead to child protection services becoming involved again in their lives. As a mum said, we don't want our kids removed. We don't want to be supervised, and we don't want a social worker on our back for 1 year, because that's what they do. I've been threatened with that. Mental health services. If a mum seemed to have a mental health or wellbeing concern, would this mean the researcher would contact the mental health crisis service? This could result in the child ending up going into foster care. Research. Mothers' fears were generalised into the research context. They lacked trust in people and systems. They had doubts and lacked confidence about research, the methods used in research, and whether children would engage in the process. A mum said, I would want to know the research. I want to know the questions, and then I would make that decision based on those questions and my knowledge of how my child would understand those questions. Researchers would not get the truth because of children's fears, and children may want to protect their family and not discuss their experiences. Research might also threaten the story. Concerns were expressed that research might lead to children developing their own narrative about their experiences. And mums were fearful that any change in the story could have serious safety and legal ramifications for them. A mum said, I was very aware of not talking to my children about domestic violence, that there was domestic violence. I had to give them a story. Providing consent for a child to participate in research could undermine the scripted story because the child would have the opportunity to voice and share their own experiences and develop their own narrative. So being asked to consent to the participation of children was a scary prospect. As one mum says here, it's like a steam train going through your head basically, or maybe a couple, like there's this steam train of thoughts and emotions just kind of colliding. And then you've got that betrayal. Oh my God, I'm betraying the abuser. What consequences are you going to get? They find out, or the abuser's family finds out. That could enter a whole new ball game. Associated with fears, mothers wanted to protect and safeguard the children. One mother described this as the protection thing, because that is the front of mind. You escape, you go back. You escape, you go back. But at the end of the day, it's all about protection and how you protect your child. Protection. The construction of meaning and meaning of protection in this research was quite multifaceted. Protection included mothers protecting their child, the family unit, the real DV that hasn't been talked about, and they don't talk about it, but the kids have witnessed and they will talk about. And there's the protection of vulnerabilities as a parent. Because of this, mums were worried about anyone talking to their child. And this includes researchers. Vulnerabilities. There were layers of vulnerabilities relating to the child, the mother, the child-mother relationship, and the impact of DV on this. Mothers considered children with experiences of domestic violence as being damaged, traumatised, which they believed impacted children's capacity and competency to participate in research. A mum said, there's trauma there. I'd be really worried how that's going to be managed. You don't want to expose your kids to that. You've got to protect your kids. Mums were very concerned about giving consent for any children under mid-teenage, for their participation in research. This research was seen better suited to older teenagers and young adults. Being in crisis was a key vulnerability. Mum spoke about being in shock, emotionally and psychologically shattered, bereft. In this state, they were hard to reach with respect to enabling children's participation. One mother described this as like being in the eye of a cyclone. Another mother said, we're just living on this adrenaline to get us through. Mothers spoke about how the DV had fractured and undermined their relationships with their children. They were worried and expressed concern that the research might further negatively impact this. Would their children blame them for not protecting them? Would the child think differently about their mothers after the research? One mother expressed concern that her boys might physically lash out at her because she didn't do enough to stand up for them. Will the child, after the research is finished, go home and hate their mother for some time? Re-traumatisation, reliving. All mothers believe that domestic violence research would result in children having to relive the memories of the violence. Children would be triggered, re-traumatised. You have to be careful. You're opening a can of worms. That child has had some trauma. Mothers wanted to move on, and they wanted this for their children. My hope and plan is that children don't have to relive it. I'm trying to diminish those thoughts. If a child participated in research, it would open up the discussion. And this quote, I think, at the bottom there, no, sorry. I'll go on without it. One mum said, I'd hate for them to think, oh, I told these people one day what had happened. Sorry, I can't get that back. And then it's going to come back and haunt them, basically. Another mum said, sometimes it brings back feelings and then you live that feeling again. Do you want your child talking about something that's going to make them live that feeling again? Thank you. There's that bottom quote there. This sums up, I think, the quote. I'm in an unknown place. I've gone to a refuge. The primary focus of the woman is to keep their kids safe. That is why they are left. And then to expose them to research. Nobody is going to get near my kids. I'm protecting them. I am the mother. I'm the gatekeeper, to use that word. Nobody is coming near my kids, and no matter what happens, you are hypersensitive to anybody talking to your children. The gateway to research, however, was not completely shut down. Mothers were full of ideas on how we could enable research in a safe way, although it would have to be incredibly safe and special research and hold a huge amount of worth regarding the outcome. As stated by one mum, I'm not dead against people talking to my kids, but what's the purpose? And what are you asking them? What do you expect of them? Foremost was building trust and rapport with mums and their children and showing mums exactly how you would safeguard their children in research. To best enable domestic violence research with children, we need to embed a child rights focused. Children do have a right to participate, it's clear in the UN Convention. Mums were very aware of children's right to have a say, but they also have rights to protection, and this was significant for all mums and for every other participant that I interviewed. The protection mandate was always going to override the participation right. This means we need to ensure safeguards. We need to privilege the child's construction of safety in the research. We need to assess the child's contact with the perpetrator. We need to seek the support of service providers and clinicians, ensuring good timing for research, for example, when there's no legal proceedings taking place. We need to involve the child in the development of safety plans and protocols. Apart from DV researchers, mums and other participants did not necessarily understand how DV research could be undertaken in a way that ensured children felt safe enough to discuss their experiences. DV research with children must be trauma safe, which means a higher level of safeguarding, where researchers have the expertise to understand the child's individual, emotional, psychological vulnerabilities and to safeguard these in the research. Researchers need to have the knowledge about what triggers trauma responses and have the expertise to manage these in a research context. Neurodevelopmental principles, trauma, attachment and family violence frameworks need to underpin the research. Child researchers need significant expertise and have the clinical skills or be supported by a team which included educational psychologists, social workers, occupational therapists, speech pathologists. Collaborative and interdisciplinary research models were considered best practice. As a mum said, you can't be a stranger that just pops up out of the blue. It's going to have to be done in a different way, bit by bit, and slowly. You have to get the trust of the child and the trust of the parent. Like any research with children, DV research with children needs to be child-friendly, child-focused, developmentally and individually focused, activity-based, flexible, creative and fun. It needs to appeal to children, such as the use of apps, avatars. It needs to be child-led, empowering and with tangible outcomes. With mothers' responses and all those participant responses, what is the best model? How do we do this? Well, I guess I developed the STAR model of attuned, safe research. And whilst I don't have the time to go into details about this, I'm just going to give you a very quick summary in my last couple of minutes. By way of summary, the STAR model of attuned trauma-safe research or participation comprises the enabling principles as suggested by participants in my research for facilitating gatekeeper and stakeholder support in conducting domestic violence research and participatory process with children. It offers points of reference for dialogue with stakeholders, gatekeepers and with children and young people about domestic violence research. It can be workshopped with children and mums. SAFE is the overriding principle of the model, and it includes safety and that the research is attuned, ethical and flexible. Trauma safe. Principles and features akin to the safety and child-centred focus established in a therapeutic setting were considered important in domestic violence research with children. Research needs to be activity-based, where activities need to be adjusted or modified to the needs of that child, taking into consideration disability, developmental needs. Research is relational, where a trusting relationship exists with children, young people, their mothers, and also with the gatekeepers, like domestic violence services. And finally, research is right-based, where the UN Convention and other conventions underpin the research. So in finishing up today, where do we go forward from here? While my research identified the significant barriers to children's research participation, the findings also inspire some sort of hope for change because they add momentum to shifting the policy and service focus onto children with experiences of domestic and family violence. My research highlighted that children are currently overshadowed in our domestic and family violence systems. We need to actively support domestic and family violence agency staff and stakeholders so they can work with children in co-leading and co-designing change. Children also need to be front and centre in our efforts to prevent domestic and family violence and how we respond. Enabling domestic violence research with children starts with recognising children's unique experiences of domestic violence and their rights to voice regarding these experiences. From there, it's about building gatekeeper partnerships that support and empower children and their mothers or caregivers throughout the research process. Research with expertise being supported, and I say that very loudly because I interviewed some researchers who felt they weren't adequately supported to do this research. So supporting our researchers to conduct sensitive, attuned and trauma-safe research is also significant to facilitating children's voices in this area of research. Why is this important? This is about rights, and it's about getting it right for children and young people with experiences of domestic and family violence. As a mum said, that kid has every right in his mouth to have his word. He's got every right underneath the sun to have his word. People say children should be seen and not heard, but I think children should be heard and seen because they have a voice. I think if you give them the opportunity to speak up, they would tell. Thank you very much. Here's my contact details, and I really would welcome anyone who would like to reach out to continue the discussion further to see how we can jointly collaborate, develop partnerships to facilitate children's participation in this area of research. Thank you.